All right, so I think we'll go ahead and kick it off. So thanks everyone for joining us. We're excited to have Octahedron's co-founder, Dr. Nabeel Ahmad, join me on this webinar, focused on having better conversations within the team. So we'll have a few polls throughout the session, as well as sharing tools that we found effective in the work that we've done with teams. So I want to kind of think about how most teams look in your company today, whether in a previous role you've had or where you are now. They've all had smart people. They've had experience, they have opinions. What they typically have is a shared way to say hard things early, clearly, and without turning the room defensive. So what happens? Concerns stay unspoken, decisions move, excuse me, decisions move too fast, and people confuse a lack of pushback with true alignment. And when that pattern repeats, it's not just communication, it becomes a trust issue. People start calculating what is safe to say, when to say it, and whether it's worth saying at all. That's when silence starts shaping decisions more than the truth does. So before we jump in further, let's take a quick poll to level set our experiences. And I'll start the poll in a second, but keep in mind, most teams, candid conversation doesn't break down for just one reason. There's usually one dominant pattern. People stay quiet, leaders move too quickly, maybe disagreement feels risky, or feedback comes too late. So let's see what's most true in your world. Okay, so it looks like Nabeel, about 50% say concerns stay unspoken. About a third say disagreement feels risky, and 20% say feedback happens too late. So it's good to see that decisions aren't being made too fast. They're not moving too fast. So that's good to see. Anything you want to add, Nabeel?
Well, first, thanks. Audio is coming through much better, so thanks for that adjustment, Rob. And similarly, we'll talk about this next, actually, is this idea around that first part, the concern staying unspoken and why it's unspoken, because there's silence is a big killer. So perhaps we can just move into that.
Absolutely.
So as Rob mentioned, I'm Nabeel with Octahedron, and both Rob and I, we have a lot of coaching conversations with leaders, and a lot of these are difficult conversations. I'd say 95% of just the personal coaching conversations that I have been in as a coach have been around navigating something that's tricky and looking for guidance. And so part of that is what we see a lot, and as I mentioned from the poll as well, is there are things that are a bit unspoken, right? Candor is low, and a lot of times what we see is it's this idea around silence. And so one is if you've ever heard the term silence equals consent, if you didn't say anything, then you must agree to whatever we had talked about. The reality is if you're on the other side of the table or the equation, then you are saying, well, I may not actually agree, but I feel uncomfortable perhaps voicing some of my concerns. And so that's really that first point here that we're talking about is that silence starts to get mistaken for alignment. And then the second one is there's something called a lagging indicator versus a leading indicator. So when the problem has already happened and then you're doing, let's call it a postmortem analysis of what occurred, that is more of a lagging indicator. So you've figured out what happens, but it's too late to do anything about it. And so we see that a lot when candor is low and for silence. And so as we go into the next slide, Rob will talk about some of the specifics on what tends to get in the way. Rob?
Yeah, thanks for that, Nabeel. I think that it's the post-mortem analysis. I think we need to come up with better ways or not having to worry about that from that aspect. Yeah, that's great. So I think, gets in the way on most teams is not really like one big dramatic problem.
Rob, real quick, your audio switched back off to
All right.
it went low again. At least for me. I'm assuming for others as well.
Yeah, let me go over here. Hold on.
No, I think it's good now.
Is it good now?
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
Let me get back over here. Sorry.
Speaking of moving too fast, right? Sometimes audio moves too fast from one to another, so it happens there. And while Rob's doing that, part of as uh, part of the reason why you're here is there's a couple of tools that will give you that will intersperse throughout the rest of this conversation to say, okay, this is great that we understand that this is a problem, but what can I do about it? What are some techniques? So we'll start to go into this in a bit more detail, and I'll just jump in for this one is typically what gets in the way are a few things as we're following that silence and candor is low. Is one is we are, let's call it bulldozing, where we're moving to get to answers too quickly instead of reading the room, allowing other people different ways to interact in the conversation. That second point is saying, okay, well, is this performative? So am I asking for input, but really I or someone or the decision has already been made? And again, think about the workplace that you're in. I'm sure we've all, including myself, been in a scenario where that is the case. And you start to uncover, let's call it a lot of these team dynamics, because that's really what this webinar is about, is how can we do this at a team level? And then a bit about what we talked about prior in that third point is silence is consent, or reading politeness as agreement. So just because I didn't say anything doesn't necessarily mean that I agree. Again, thinking on the other side as well, if you don't say anything, I can't read your mind. So, is it a catch-22 situation? So we're going to talk about some of those practical tools that you could take back to your team, your workplace, et cetera, to apply there. And then the last one is around conflict, as can we use it to smooth over something instead of working through? And again, we'll talk a bit about this. One other thing before we go to the next slide that I'll mention is I've been teaching at Columbia University graduate schools for 17 years or so. And the reason why I bring it up is I have my current class that I'm teaching. I have a final presentations for teams in the class tomorrow night. And so as I'm going through and I'm meeting with these teams individually, I can pick up on a lot of these dynamics already. And so part of it is trying to better understand who is doing what, but then also what is our responsibility to try to improve the team dynamics. So let's get into the next slide here, which gives us our first practical tool. And we've talked a bit about this at a high level already. It's this idea of ask before you tell. And so one way to do it is avoid using the word why. Why do you think this way? Or why didn't you do this? Or why did you do that? Instead, start to probe a bit more and say, help me understand your perspective or your point of view on something, to give them the floor where they're not being judged, but also the space to be able to explain their perspective. And you can see a couple of other quotes on the right side around some techniques. It feels like there's more here, et cetera. And so those are a couple of things, but really with this first tool, try to frame it in avoiding the why questions. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And we'll see that with a later tool as well about separating the person from the issue. But really for this one is probe more and ask more open-ended questions. So instead of, and I'm guilty of this, by the way, is does it make sense? Right? Is that's one of my less than stellar fallback questions. But it's really like, if it doesn't make sense, will somebody actually speak up and say it? Perhaps not. So the question then becomes is how can I ask better questions to get better feedback? And I see a comment from Tim in the chat, so thanks for that. The art of open and humble inquiry questions. Great comment there. Rob, anything to add before we go on?
No, can you hear me okay now?
For now, yes.
All right, good. We'll see if we can leave it that way. No, I think it's great. I think you made some really great points, and I think it's a lot of what we're talking about in the tools that Nabeel and I will be covering today. We may know, it's just trying to keep it front of mind.
All right, so let's go and let's get to our second poll. So get your mouse ready and let's launch that one. So how is conflict addressed on your team? And again, this is all anonymous, so we're just curious in your honest feedback on that. So the poll is now open, and we'll just take in 30, 45 seconds or so until we get a majority, and then we'll move on. I think we've got about 60, 70%. We'll let it go
Tim
for
wants an option E, all of the above.
the above. Yeah, it's not.
That's great.
Or is it great? I guess we'll
Or
find
yeah,
out.
I was looking, I was handled immediately. Yeah. So yeah, so it could be, to Tim's point, it could be a mixed, right? I think we're more looking for, like, what is the most, how does it often happen on a regular basis?
Let's go ahead and end the poll, and then we'll share the results to make sure we can all see. All right, so take just a quick second and look at that. So we're seeing a good mix between, again, as Rob was saying, it gets softened to avoid friction. And again, that'll be one of the tools we'll talk about is separating the person from the problem or the issue, and then also into side conversations. I'm curious from your perspective, Rob, is that I feel like I could read that option D, side conversations, in two ways. Sometimes is that a good side conversation because it doesn't necessarily need to involve the whole team, or is it a not so good one because there's a conflict and perhaps there is discomfort, let's call it, in bringing it up to the team. What are your thoughts on that, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, it can go, to your point, it can go either way. I think one of the challenges that too often it's done outside the room without everyone else not really being involved. So whether it's in the hallway or it's a one-on-one, typically, well, working with the teams we've seen where it's not where the leader is involved. So it's generally, probably I'd say two-thirds of the time, it's more of they're not creating a safe space to have that conversation. To your point, however, there are times where it might just be kind of a one-on-one, hey, like, I didn't want to bring this up in the meeting because I didn't want to derail it. Like, what are your thoughts about doing this? And then if it makes sense, pulling the team back together and saying, hey, you know what? Nabil brought up a great idea. He didn't want to derail us, but I really think we need to kind of revisit and go back. So there are certain circumstances where having that side conversation can make sense. Absolutely.
All right, so let's get into the next point is this idea around, as we're talking about whether it shifts into side conversations or it gets softened, et cetera, there's this concept called productive conflict, which is saying, okay, how can I have a disagreement or a difference in opinion about something, but also make sure that it doesn't become a session where I just want to whine or complain and that there's actually an end goal or result with that. And so there's different terms for it, but for the purposes of today, we'll use this productive conflict. And so the idea is, well, how can we best go about doing it? And then really to take a step back, is it your responsibility or whose responsibility is it, if anyone, to actually go along this route? So in a more detailed example, I had mentioned some of the classes that I'm teaching. There's a final case presentation that my students, about 30 or so students, 6 or 7 groups, are presenting in my class tomorrow. And I had a prep session with each of the teams individually over the past week. And so, as you could imagine, as I'm meeting with the teams, there's no requirement in the way that they should be talking to me or whatnot, but a lot of team dynamics do show up. And it's really interesting that some of the groups, you can tell there's one person who is basically trying to be the hero for the team. They're sharing their slides, they're asking all the questions that they're interested in. And then when they're done, they stop sharing their slides and they say, okay, thank you. And then one of those groups, another team member said, oh, I have some questions on my part as well. And so the reason why I bring it up is, one, I can imagine you have been or maybe are right now in a team dynamic situation where something like this happens. And then two is, well, what can or should we do about it? Because is it, maybe it's, if you don't address it, maybe the outcome will still be okay for whatever the project or task that you're working on. On the other end is, what is the rest of the team's likeliness or desire to continue to work with that team member. And that's a lot of times that sort of downstream effect is where we tend to think less of it in the moment. And so again, back to this concept around productive conflict is to say, I'm actually going to have a conversation personally with a few of these students where I've noticed a few things to say, hey, listen, this is less around you. And maybe we Rob, can we go to the next slide to talk about the tool is to separate the person from the problem. So part of it is to say, okay, how can we say if the person is the problem, one, that's one type of conversation. And the way that I frame it a lot is I am vested in your success. I want to see you succeed as an independent third party person to this conversation. Here's what I have seen and here's some observations and take it for what it's worth. That's one. Back to the productive conflict is people take things personally, whether we like it or not, right? We've all been in that boat because especially if you're close to something, it feels like a personal attack. So your ability to frame things in a way to challenge the idea, as you see on the right side, that first bullet is I want to challenge the idea or at least discuss the idea and not necessarily your intent. That's one as well. Another one is ensuring that each side understands that you're both on the same team trying to achieve the same outcome. So this is another tool that we see over and over is the more that you can clearly, let's call it delineate between the messenger and the message, so to speak, then the increased likelihood that you'll have to be able to do this in a productive way. Rob, anything to add on this?
No, I think the challenging the idea, not the person. I think that's key. And like you said, like people will take it personally, right? But we're talking about the idea. And when you're tied to the idea as a leader or someone presenting the idea, you have to be able to kind of separate that and not necessarily take it personally, but focus on the idea or the problem that you're discussing.
One other example I'll give just to try to bring this more to light is I remember working with someone who they basically it was like a passion project or they had this idea of something that they were going to do. They got buy-in for it. And then as they started, let's calling it moving it up the chain to get buy-in and approval and feedback, et cetera, it became clear that anything that was counter to or alternate to their initial vision, their reaction was very strong in a not so good way. And so they would tend to shut it down fairly quickly. And so, again, I imagine we've probably all, for better or worse, been exposed to an environment like that. And so some of these techniques can help to say, listen, we're all trying to do the same thing here. And the probably some of the best things is to avoid any kind of personal things and say, all right, well, let's figure out what our North Star is and then how can we get there while understanding that emotions are part of the equation, but we want to make sure that it doesn't derail it. Right. So let's go on to our next one.
Great. Thanks, Nabeel. I think one of the fastest ways to make a room more uncomfortable is to pretend that tension isn't there, right? Um, so people can feel it regardless. So naming it doesn't create the tension. It simply stops the room from spending the energy managing what everyone already senses. So people look like that they're actually agreeing, but their body language may not match. So I remember early in my career, I was in my early 20s. I was brand new to the company. I'd been there maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And my manager kind of noticed I was kind of like squirming a little bit in my seat, right? I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to be that person, right? And he kind of called me out and said, "Hey, Rob, like, I noticed you're kind of like, you might have a question." I was like, "No, no, no, I'm fine." And he said, "Well, no, like, come on, like, go ahead and share. No one's going to bite your head off." So when I finally did share, he actually took the time and then he asked other people in the room if they had the same concerns. A few of them did. And then all of a sudden, other concerns started to come up as well. So that one meeting created a path forward where we were kind of able to work together as a strong team. And I still think about him today. Like he was the best manager I ever had. And what's fascinating from my perspective is that he was also the only manager I ever worked under that did not have a degree in leadership or in business. And he also had the least amount of training. He showed up because he was a genuine person that actually cared about what this looked like. He created a safe space for people to share their ideas, their tensions, and their thoughts. So that was, for me, that was super impactful. And like I said, today, I mean, I'm in my 50s, so he had a huge impact on me. And I wish that I was able to say that there's other managers that were as good as he was, but there really wasn't. Anything you want to add, Nabeel?
Thanks for that, Rob. One other thing is it could come down to a personality style as well, but some ways that I try to decrease the tension in the room is to poke fun at myself. So, for example, I had mentioned in my Columbia class where they had this big presentation tomorrow, and I can tell they're really nervous. I mean, they're really nervous because I think they think I'm going to grill them hard, which, again, for the purposes of the class, I will. But it's also to encourage them and say, hey, listen, you can do this, right? It's not ride or die here. And part of what I'm going to do is to tell them when I was in a situation in a master's program and I had a big presentation and how I accidentally sent my deck. It was a competition between 6 or 7 teams. I accidentally sent my deck and set it to my team to the entire class. So everybody knew what our talking points were before. And this was like if we won first prize, we got $10,000 or so, right? And so, long story short, my team ended up getting second. So we were the first people to get nothing. And you could imagine how bad I felt around that. But my point is that if you are comfortable showing where you have been involved in a certain situation and it didn't turn out as well, then that can start to cut through the tension and ease some of the burdens that people may be putting on themselves. And again, these are just some different techniques to do it. But the most important part, as Rob mentioned, is just to understand and name it and put it out there. Rob,
I love that. So much for the 10 grand win. All right.
no, still haunts me.
Fourth tool. And they will. And I think I think being able to talk about it, the more you talk about it, the more you're able to accept it and move on from our mistakes. We all make them. Um, so invite feedback with specificity. Specificity. Broad questions produce broad answers. So if you ask, oh, any thoughts? You usually get politeness. If you ask more specifically, like what risk are we underestimating? Or what feels incomplete here? You might get a much more usable truth. Not does this work for everyone, right? But where could we fail? So too often throughout my career, I experienced those broad asks, right? The ones that leaders ask where, like they're not really asking, right? For me, I could literally feel the frustration in the room. My colleagues and I kind of looked at each other knowing that our opinions didn't matter. And it really wasn't a good feeling. I mentioned my first manager. I don't know if he necessarily had the understanding of these tools that we're talking about, but he had already created that safe space. So if you've already created a safe space as a leader, you may not need to utilize this tool, but it's important to reflect real time and in the room if the questions you're asking are too broad, right? So as you're going through this, and again, all the tools we're sharing, we may be aware of what they are, but once we get moving too fast, we might start to they might start to disappear in how we're interacting or utilizing them. So when you're asking questions, maybe write down the questions as you're asking them so you can reflect back on them and say, okay, was that the right question? Or was it too broad?
One other thing I would add, and thanks for that, Rob, is I remember on a team I had years ago, 10, 12 people or so, and think about what your position is on the team. Are you part of the team? Are you the team leader? And regardless of what that is one another tool that you could use to do this to get specific feedback is to before you meet as a team. So typically think about how do you get feedback right now? So perhaps you send out some pre-read or something, but then the first time when your team comes together, you're together and everyone's giving feedback. So think about the dynamics there because there are a lot of people who may have some good feedback, but they are, to Rob's point, they may not feel that they have the pedigree, the background, or the experience, or the basis to actually make some of the comments that they're making, even though they may be just as good, if not more valuable than some of the others. So the question is what could you do about that to start to elicit that feedback? one of the tools that I had used in the past is to say, okay, I'm going to send this out. We're meeting on Thursday. I'm sending out the pre-read for what I want your feedback on Monday. Before Thursday, read it independently, send me an email about what your thoughts are, and then we will collate them and anonymously put all the feedback together in the meeting on Thursday. So it's a bit about one of the prior tools is separating the person from instead of the problem. In this case, it's more from the challenge, the idea, the feedback, etc. And so what I found out is, as you could imagine, some of the people who were talking the most, and because of their personality in a meeting, and they tend to then get the most airtime, their feedback was not necessarily better than some of the quieter people. And so that's really what we're trying to give you a tool here is to say, how can you balance that and normalize that out and make sure that you're giving everyone an equal opportunity? So the closing point for this one is people talk or give feedback in different ways, and it's on you as being a part of a team and or a team leader to not only understand that, but to get that feedback in different ways. And those are some of the methods that you can do that.
Yeah, I love that, Nabeel, because I think that one of the things that reminds me of is on our team, someone approached me and said, it takes me some time to kind of process the information that you're sharing. And then another person on our team was an introvert. They never felt comfortable in the room. So what you were able to do by you sending that out beforehand, right, and something that we started to do, it kind of allows that ability for people to show up and be prepared, even if it's something where they do need to present or speak to. It gives them time to really kind of focus on what's being asked of them. Yeah, that's great.
And so we have one more tool just to level set for the rest of our time here today. We're going to talk about this tool, then we'll have one more poll, and then we're going to open it up for conversation. And then we also have, if you stick around till the end, an opportunity for you to say, well, how do I do this? And we have a tool that you can use for free to test out and get some feedback on your own team. Okay, so our last one is responding without punishing honesty. So I'll give you another example. My first full-time interview for a job out when I graduated undergrad college is I was in this interview. It was 20 something questions or so. I was getting just peppered with questions about technical things here and there. And there became one where I didn't know the answer. And I'm like, I don't know. And so this is real time. So they're asking me a question and I'm just drawing a blank face. Right. And again, I'm thinking about my class tomorrow because I had told them this, I gave them some of this feedback as well. And what I told the interview panel, I said, honestly, I have no idea what the answer is. And they just kind of smirked at me or laughed, and then they moved on. A week later, I get the job offer. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I guess it wasn't that bad. And then in my first few weeks in working at the company, something comes up, and then I remember that, and I talked to my manager. I said, hey, remember in the interview you had asked me this question or so? And then he kind of laughed it off, and he said, honestly, I was more glad that you said you didn't know than trying to make up something. And that was the point that I had given to my class in a note that I sent to them for this week is to say, if you don't know something, that's okay. I'd rather you be honest with what you are actually thinking than giving me what you think I want to hear. And so this is one of those tools where you can do that and say, okay, well, the way to do it is to say, how do you ensure that you have an environment where it's okay to not know or not be right on the first time? And this is an interesting thing about a lot of workplace culture is that if you look at if we take a step back and look at R&D, which is research and development, nothing great ever happens on the first time. I mean, very rarely, maybe less than 0.1%. But in the workplace, a lot of times we are expected to be not only on point, but everything needs to be right the first time. But it's just not possible to do that. And so then it starts to become well, what's our culture like? And can we start to adjust the culture where we can encourage people being honest, even if we know it's a process instead of an end result? And so that is the other tool that you can use and have in your belt is to showcase. And again, if you are a team leader, what typically happens through team dynamics is people look up to their boss, where if their boss is not doing it or their team leader is not doing it, then it gets back to that first one. Is silence or is not talking about it, is that consent? And maybe I shouldn't do it. So if I don't do it, I can't be punished, type of thing. And so this is the other one where you could start to not only demonstrate for your team, but also encourage them to be honest. And some of the techniques, as you see on the right side, by saying more, okay, walk me through what you're seeing. You know what? The last one, there's I think Amazon was famous for this: disagree and commit. I actually disagree with what you're saying, but I'm going to commit to it because you know more about this, and let's see where it goes. And so this is a honesty is still a good policy for sure. And the way that you can encourage that in your teams tends to be it will pay dividends in return. And so before we get to the poll, Rob, anything you want to add, or let's open it up for questions?
Yeah, I think I think for me, one of the biggest things that brings to mind with leadership as far as respond without punishing honesty is the leader being vulnerable. I know that I remember I spent an entire weekend building out a solution to the problem when we were trying to launch a new product, and I thought it was pretty amazing. And then on Monday, I met with our team, and my bubble got burst very quickly, very professionally. Like they were saying, "Well, here's an issue. Here's an issue." We ended up bringing in about 60% of what they said to change it. And looking back on it, I was proud that I was able to create a safe space for them to share, but it was definitely a vulnerable space for me to be in. And I'm obviously talking about it still to this day. So it kind of definitely threw me off because I thought I had the answer. So as far as a leadership goes, it's being vulnerable, and that's super important.
All right, so let's get into our final poll, and then we will open it up to the floor for questions and comments.
The final poll is: what would be impactful for your team today? Asking questions, raising concerns earlier, inviting different opinions, or asking for feedback.
And we know, similar to some of the other polls, is that there's probably multiple ones that you're thinking, but just think of what would be the most impactful for today if you had to choose one. Which is a difficult thing to do sometimes, so we understand.
All
All
right.
right,
So
some good
let's,
results here. We see a
yeah.
little bit of balance between the first two around asking questions and raising concerns earlier. And that speaks to some of the things that we had talked about as well. I'll say something quick about the first one, Rob, and then if you want to add on the asking questions, I have two middle schoolers right now, and the for those of you who have kids maybe around the same age, younger or older, I talked about a bit about it before. Is their number one answer is why? Like why? It's starting to get under my skin there. But asking questions and probing, and as we talked about, I believe in one of the early tools, is ask open-ended questions instead of closed-ended questions. Are you ready to go to school? Or did you do this? Those are more closed-ended, and say, help me understand. Can you explain to me what you were thinking through this? How do you feel that this is going to help our team going forward? And start to get them to elaborate a bit more. Because there are a lot of personalities and people who they are not necessarily going to say something, but they are more reactive, which is not a bad thing. And so the opportunity for you is not just to ask the questions, but ask the questions that will elicit the best type of feedback. So that's one. And then Rob, do you want to talk a bit about the other popular one, which was raising concerns earlier?
Yeah. Thanks, Nabeel. That was great. I think that, this is where you have those side conversations in the hallway that Nabeel and I were talking about earlier. And there's a couple ways to approach this because once you start to realize that's occurring, it can be very frustrating, especially from a leadership perspective. So it's not about targeting the individual. It's about saying, okay, how can I create the ability for people to raise their concerns earlier instead of having it in side conversations in the hallway or on their desks over Slack or chat or whatever they're using, right? And so it's also going to that person. So if I notice Nabeel's talking with one of the team members and I walk on, I was like, hey, how's it going? Oh, good. We were kind of talking like we're a little concerned about how this product is going to be launched with the marketing team not being fully bought in. Instead of being frustrated and saying, well, Nabeel, why didn't you bring that to me earlier? Saying, okay, well, let's grab the team and pull them together and have a conversation. And then maybe saying to Nabeel after, again, to Nabeel's point earlier, being vulnerable in the room, saying, hey, listen, Nabeel was talking with some of you. This is a really good point. Let's address this. And then pulling Nabeel aside and saying, hey, Nabeel, so what can I do to make sure that these concerns are addressed earlier? Right? That's being vulnerable as a leader and allowing your team members to say, well, Rob, usually when you come in a room, it kind of seems like you're just sharing it with us. You're not really asking for our opinions, right? So these are different opportunities, not, right? Don't look at it as a failure. It's an opportunity where we can do better as leaders and try to strengthen our team overall.
Right. All right. So with that, let's spend the last few minutes and let's open it up to whether you want to come off mute or in the chat, comments, questions, concerns, feedback. And then we will end with an opportunity for you to take an assessment, a free assessment with your team and get more of the how. How can I actually do this and get some data to back it up? So questions, comments, feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, use the chat feature. We will be monitoring it.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Alston. I run a culture building firm out of Connecticut, and I'm just curious. Part of the conversation always leads to the dynamics of psychological safety, Amy Edmondson's research on that. That said, there has been discussions and movement within the industry about our inability to truly create psychological safety, knowing that it's subjective to the individuals in the room, how they're feeling in the room, who's present. And so rather than organizations saying, hey, this is a great safe space for you, you can share anything, talking to and encouraging teams to engage in more bravery and courage, leading to a sense of greater safety, but kind of shelving the language of announcing that this is a safe space. So I'm just curious where that lands with you all from your perspective.
Thanks for that, Yvonne. Rob, you.
Sure, I can jump in, Nabeel. I want to hear your thoughts too. So, when we built our team building product, we actually did it it was part of Amy's work as well as others. And it was focused on psychological safety and cognitive diversity. We realized quickly, to your point, that you're not going to be able to create a perfect world or a perfect bubble where everyone feels psychologically safe. So we started focusing more on trust. And to your point, Yvonne, yes, there's no way to get to the point where it's 100% safe, right? And maybe safe is not the word we should be utilizing. It's more about creating the opportunity for people to be able to share their thoughts or perspectives without feeling attacked, right? Trying to make sure that they feel belong as part of a team. And I think that the leaders have a responsibility in their position to create opportunities for people to feel that they're able to share their thoughts in different ways. So we mentioned earlier where, Nabeel was saying he was sharing information before the meeting so people had time to process it, whether they're neurodivergent, whether they're an introvert, or they just want to be able to put their pieces together, right? We want to make sure that it's not the same voices over and over again, right? As an extrovert, I know I'm happy to walk in the meeting and I'll definitely give you my opinion, right? That doesn't necessarily mean it's always the right opinion or that we shouldn't be talking about other differences. So it's trying to find different ways to allow for people to share. So I appreciate and fully agree with you that the goal is not to have everyone feel quote unquote safe. It's that everyone has the ability to share their perspective because from my perspective, if I have a team that we're paying a lot of money for, I don't want them to just go and do the work. I want to hear from them. I want to make sure what I'm paying, the company's paying for their time and their mind. I want to make sure we're getting their thoughts and their perspectives. Nabeel, anything to add?
Yeah, I think Yvonne, thank you for the question. And on top of Rob's point, to keep it brief, where the the underlying question is how can I get a representative sample of what is happening? And then, as Rob had mentioned, what is the best way to do that? It's typically a multimodal effort. So instead of just a live type session, I had mentioned, okay, maybe you can send some individual feedback. A big thing that we see, especially around psychological safety or trust, is anonymity. So can I give some feedback where one of our earlier tools was separating the challenge or problem or issue from the person. Well, if I don't know who said it, and it doesn't matter as much, then why do I need to know who said it? So there's an opportunity to elicit feedback in an anonymous way as well. And I did this with my current semester class at Columbia. About halfway through, I said, "Hey, listen, I'm curious what you think, how you think the class is going, and how we can improve it while you're still in the class. So think in your workplace while you're still on the team, how can we improve it there?" And again, there's a couple of nuances here and there. And I got everyone filled out the feedback. I don't know who said what, and it didn't matter. And what I did is I said, okay, let's figure out where the common themes are. Let's report back to the class, or in your case, the team, and then say, here's what we're going to do as a result. And so when people start to see how you are leveraging their feedback to improve their situation, then the follow-on effect will be you'll start to open up a bit more trust. So thank you for that question. They're very important. And just looking through the chat to see if there are other ones. Anne and Tim, thank you for the comments on that. Yvonne, thanks as well. So other questions or comments as we wrap up? By the way, whenever I ask my class, how's it going so far? It's just like the distribution you would think. Some people think it's the best thing since sliced bread. The other people can't be bothered to like, oh, why am I even in here? That type of thing. And then a lot of it are kind of in the middle. And so with the feedback that you get from your team, just depending on the size and the type of feedback, is what I have learned over the years is you kind of take your best and your worst comments and then you put them to the side and you figure out what you can do to move the mean or move the middle towards more of what your ideal situation looks like.
Well, if no one else is going to ask another question, I just had one, if you don't mind. I'm curious, Nabeel and Robert, what language do you use for inviting dissent into conversations? The idea of, throwing spaghetti at the wall. I know for me and my team, I'll say, okay, let's risk mitigate now. Poke holes in this opportunity, poke holes in this theory or this principle. How does this land well? How does it not? So I'm just curious from your standpoints, how do you all invite dissent?
Yeah, thanks for that, Yvonne. There's one where I was what I like to do is say, where will this not work and why? And help me understand where it is. And then this is really getting more to a bit what Rob was talking about. Of the academic term is called cognitive diversity, but really it's about differing opinions or multiple perspectives. So help us understand. And the idea, as we may know, is that if on your team you have people who have different perspectives and opinions and knowledge, and they can surface that, then the outcome or the product of the work that your team does goes up more because you're starting to take into consideration different areas. So back to your question on inviting dissent, what I like to do is say, tell me where this won't work. And because a lot of times people like the critical nature of things and poking holes in arguments. So that's some of the specific language I use. Rob, what do you have?
I think it's going back to, and you mentioned this earlier, kind of telling on yourself or being vulnerable, right? So one of the things I might do, Vaughn, if I was in that situation with a different team than I had in the past, was say, listen, I really need you all to kind of share this, like share what your feedback is, share what your thoughts are. I think this is amazing, but I need you to poke holes in it. And let's see how many holes we can poke in this, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure this is successful. So I think, again, being vulnerable and being able to have a conversation with your team, like how you're dealing with them now, when you're dealing with different clients, because I know you said you have an organization, I think it's finding different ways to create, because teams have been managed a certain way. And as someone I think was Tim was saying in the chat, that's great tools. It's a lot harder to put into practice. So it's going to take some time. Too often we see people take one or two of these tools and then no one's saying anything. They're like, oh, well, see, then they're fine with it. It takes time to retrain people of how you're going to respond. So we want to make sure that people are patient, that they realize that, silence is not alignment. Conflict's only dangerous when teams don't know how to work with it. And the real test of candor is how leaders respond when honesty shows up. And that's where that kind of vulnerability comes up.
All right. Well, I know we're at time here and wrapping up, and so thank you, one, for your time. It's very valuable. We hope that you took away at least one practical example or tool that you could apply back into your workplace. And then as we close out, I mentioned a couple of times is if you have a team, whether you're on a team or you're working with a client or so, we're more than happy to, we have a tool that can help. It's an anonymous based tool based for teams that can help to give you some data to start to have some of these conversations on where I should focus. And if there is any interest, again, there's no strings attached, no obligation. We're happy to set you and your team up with a test run for a team. And it takes about 3 minutes, 25 or so questions, and you'll get a detailed report, and then you can decide what you want to do with it next there. And so with that, Rob, I will pass it to you as we close out.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining. We appreciate your time. Hope you have an amazing week. Any questions, reach out to us. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. And yeah, have a great week.
Thank you all.